This is the cheat sheet review for 3 lessons, constructors in 43, naming conventions in 44, and static and instance members in 45. So let's go ahead and get started with creating constructor methods in CS-ASP 043. And so you'll recall that constructors are called at the moment of instantiation. Instantiation. And they're used to put the new instance of the class into a valid state. And we talked about why that's so important. We don't want a new instance of the class to just be out there with no state, even if it's for one line of code. It's ideal to put that new class into a valid state by setting its properties. Generally, that's what it means. All right, so let me go ahead and just create a real simple constructor here by creating a public class foo. Who knows what foo is? It's often used for software developers, just a silly word. And so if we want to create a constructor, we would go foo, public foo, like so. And that would be it. Notice that there's no identifier of being a method, and no return value, and that it does have an open and close parentheses, and that whenever you create a new instance of a class and you use that open and close parentheses, you're basically calling the constructor at that moment. Okay? So let me just do this like so. Okay. So whether you define it or not, there's a default constructor. You can override it like we just did here in the above example, which basically means you're going to give it no input parameters like the default, or you can overload it to allow the user to set the new instance to a valid state. Great. Okay, so that's all we really need to remember about creating constructors, or actually utilizing constructors. All right, moving on. Let's go to naming conventions for identifiers. And that was CS-ASP 044. All right, and right off the bat, you recall that there were 2 different types of casing. There was Pascal casing, and whenever you think Pascal, think in general, we're talking about the accessibility modifier called public. And then there's camel case, and you can see I used P, capital P for the Pascal case, lowercase c for the camel case, and that's private and protected in general. All right, so let's go down the list. Public classes, methods and properties, those should be Pascal case. Private helper methods and input parameters, those should be camel case. Locally scoped variables, those should be camel case. Private fields were a special case. We said it should be camel case, but it needs to be prefixed with an underscore. So let's give a good example of that. So underscore, lowercase f, and first, capital N in name, like so. Okay? And then just some other suggestions for creating good variable names. You should choose long, memorable, understandable names that convey meaning or intent. In other words, don't make me think. If I'm looking at your code, I don't need to decipher through your crazy convention. I just want to be able to read what the purpose of this variable is. It should be self-documenting. That word self-documenting means you don't need code comments because your code reads like English. Okay? So moving on to the next lesson here, it was static versus instance members. And so this was CS-ASP 045. And we said that static members, there's no instance of the class required in order to call one of its methods, to call the method that you're looking for, the static method, okay, or whatever the case might be. Whereas in an instance member, you basically must create an instance with the new keyword to call methods and properties on that given class. All right. So you can mix both in the same class, but you can't reference instance members from inside of static members. Remember when we tried that and we compiled and it said you can't do that. And furthermore, classes can be decorated, entire classes decorated with the static keyword. And basically all that means is that all the members must be static, and furthermore, you can't create an instance of the class. And you can mix both in the same class, but you can't reference instance members from inside of static members. So if you recall in the video, I created a property and then I tried to use that property inside of a static method, and it said, oh, you can't do that because you can't use a instance member inside of a static member. Okay. And furthermore, entire classes can be decorated with the static keyword. And when you do that, all members must be static. In other words, well, and another ramification of it, I should say, is that you can't create a new instance of that class. And if you try, you're going to get an exception. And a good example of this is the system.math class in the .NET Framework class library. And just for reference, remember we looked at this article, and it showed us like the definition of that class. It had the static keyword, and then every one of its members were also static. And it's great whenever you're creating utility methods like the math class. It doesn't need to have any properties. It doesn't need to have any state. It's a concept. It's a container for related math related functions, and therefore all the methods can be static. Okay, so that wraps up those 3 lessons. Hope those were helpful to you as you use the .NET Framework class library, not necessarily using them on your own classes just yet, maybe later. And let's continue on. We'll talk to you in the next lesson. Thanks.